What's good, YouTube? It's me, boy Squid, back in another video. Today, let's talk about how to beat the Fire King deck. Yep, this deck has exploded onto the metagame with the advent of the structure deck. And although it's not nearly as powerful as it will be post Phantom Nightmare, yep, right now it's just a watered down version without the new Sinful Spoils engines that we are getting in that upcoming set. It's still good enough. Apparently, 3 to 4 of these actually top 64 YCS Bologna, which had over 2,000 players over the past weekend. And I imagine it's in part because people are kind of unfamiliar with the cards, and the cards have a lot of text. It's very easy to get overwhelmed with what these cards do exactly, you know, between the old cards and the newer ones. But I thought I'd make this video just to talk about it, and let's see how we can actually beat this deck in its current form. So let's talk about how the deck plays. For those of you guys that don't know, this deck revolves around destroying their own monsters, and then the monsters get effects in the graveyard, or they get resurrected over and over again, which is in lore with the Phoenix archetype, I imagine. Now, how the deck actually functions against its opponent is it puts up 3 major points of disruption currently. The first disruption let's talk about is actually bridged through their new signature boss monster, Sacred Fire King Garunix, which says if a monster that was originally fire type is destroyed by battle or card effect, you can special summon this card from your graveyard or your hand, and then if this card is special summoned or normal summoned, you can destroy one fire, beast, beast wing, or wing beast directly from your hand, field, or your deck. Yep, you can actually destroy cards from your deck now with this card, which is just the level of power creep. The critical card that you want to destroy is their new card called Fire King High Avatar Kirin. When this card is destroyed from anywhere, they can actually resurrect any Fire King monster from their hand or their graveyard, special summon it to the board, and then they get to pop a card, non-targeting. So they can pop their own cards to further their combos, or they can choose to pop their opponent's cards and then therefore serve as disruption, right? So Garunix kind of turns that on by dumping Kirin directly to the graveyard. And the interesting thing to note is that Kirin is actually a lot like the Unchained Soul of Shavara, because during the main phase, if it's in their hand, they can quick effect destroy one other fire monster in their hand or face up field, and then special summon this card. So cards like Infinite Impermanence and Veiler will actually be punished by this card directly. That's one thing to note. The other point of disruption is actually none other than an older card, Fire King Avatar Arvada. This card says when a monster effect is activated, you can quick effect negate that activation and then destroy a face-up fire monster in your hand or your field. So this is kind of like, you know, negate the activation, a lot like Appaloosa. It doesn't destroy, but it can negate cards like Nibiru. It can negate monster effects from anywhere. So that's your second point of interruption. And then the third point of in-engine interruption is actually a newer card called Fire King Sanctuary, which when activated allows them to place the Fire King Island directly onto the table. So it's almost like a pseudo terraforming, but that's not all. The disruptive effect comes in at the second line of text. It says, once per turn, if your opponent special summons a monster, you can immediately after this effect resolves, XYZ summon one Fire XYZ monster using only Fire King monsters you control. So that's easily made with their level 8 Sacred Fire King Garunix, which is on the table, and then the Kirin, which is also level 8, to go into this new bad boy. Garunix Entity Hyang of the Fire Kings, which says if this card is XYZ summoned, you can destroy all other monsters on the field. Boom. Dark Hole when this monster is summoned. So these are the 3 cards that you do have to keep your tab on when you're playing against this deck. Obviously the Garunix to dump the Kirin to resurrect something and pop something. You have the Arvada to kind of deal with, which by the way can also be special summoned off of the Kirin from their hand or graveyard, and then of course the Sanctuary, which will punish you if you special summon and then go into the Hyang. So without further ado, now you kind of know how the deck works. Let's talk about hand traps. Ash Blossom Joy Spring. In my opinion, currently, the biggest card to Ash is none other than Fire King Island. This card says, during your main phase, you can destroy a monster in your hand or field, and if you do, add one Fire King monster from your deck to your hand. Well, again, we talked about the monsters triggering when a monster card is destroyed. So, Ash does 2 things. It prevents the destruction of a card, and it prevents them from searching the Sacred Fire King Garunix. So their typical play goes something like normal summon the Phoenix, add a copy of the Fire King Sanctuary, set up the island, use the effect to pop the Phoenix, and then add the big Garunix. Garunix can actually trigger, because it can trigger if it's in the hand. You know, it's a lot like Salamangreat Gazelle and Sign Up Mining back in the day. The ruling is you can still trigger it, even though it didn't see the card being destroyed. And then you summon out the Garunix, you dump stuff, and you're off to the races. So if we're actually ashing Fire King Island, we're preventing them from popping the baby and also summoning out the Fire King Garunix. Even if they hard drew a copy of Garunix, they're still going to look for another way to destroy their card in order to summon it out. So that's where Ash is very, very nice. Other cards you can potentially Ash are Pot of Prosperity, because they do play that. So if they go Pros for 6, maybe you could argue potentially ashing this. I think Fire King Island is still a bigger choke point, so personally I'd rather hold it for this unless you're scared of some going first Floodgate card. Other cards that you can actually Ash are cards like, I guess, Ponyx, you could technically ash if you're scared of Fire King Skyburn, which is a card they can add as well, that says target an equal number of Fire King monsters you control and cards your opponent controls, destroy them. You could potentially have an argument to ashing Ponyx, but I still think Fire King Island is like the biggest one. The other thing is they do actually play the Sinful Spoils engine, right? So if they are going Dark Witch, discard a card and then set Snake Eye, use Snake Eye, that could be a card to ash as well, because this is how they actually bridge into the Ponyx. And ashing here actually means that if they don't have a follow-up, they've invested 2 cards into the Dark Witch. That means that they might have to pass their turn. So that's definitely something you consider ashing as well. If my opponent actually starts with Dark Witch and they go Snake Eye sending the Dark Witch, I think I'm probably going to ash there just because you're investing 2 cards and it's a heavy 2 for 1, right? You could potentially argue waiting for the bird to be summoned, but then they kind of snowball and get the Fire King Island. So it can actually be very punishing. At the very least, if they already have Island, then they add the Skyburn, which is another point of interaction. So I would personally just ash the Sinful Spoils if they're starting with Dark Witch. That's just my opinion there. Next, let's talk about Droll Knockbird. It's actually not too bad against this deck, depending on what line they open. It can either be decently good, or it can be also horrible, as Droll tends to be. Now, what I mean by that is, if they start off with the Ponyx and they use the effect to add a copy of the Fire King Sanctuary, then the Droll Knockbird goes really hard here, because their Fire King Island is not going to be able to activate and resolve, so you're essentially basically ashing the Fire King Island in this instance, right? You're stopping it from resolving for the rest of the turn. You're also turning off cards like Pot of Prosperity and any other cards that might add. The issue is if they don't lead off Ponyx, if they're going like Fire King Island, destroy the Ponyx, add a copy of Garunix, then Droll Knockbird gets bad because it doesn't really do that much. You're not really stopping any potential high impact searches. They don't need to search at that point. As long as they have access to Garunix, they start playing. Now they're starting to destroy cards from their deck, destroying Kieran, resurrecting stuff, making a board. So the Droll Knockbird is effectively you hand ripping yourself for 1 card, which is not very good. They can also send a copy of Brong, destroyed directly from their deck, which searches during the next standby phase, which means Droll is not going to be in effect anymore, so it doesn't really matter. So it really depends. If you're main decking it, you know when to use Droll. Obviously on the first search, it can't hurt if they lead off with something like a Ponyx or a Pot of Prosperity, but if they're starting off and they already have Garunix, then it's just not very, very good. So personally, I would not actually bring this in against this deck per se, but it's just like, you know, if you have it in your main deck already, or if you have nothing better to side out, it's still playable against this deck. It's not the end of the world. Next is NIBIRU, which is not that great against this deck because they can easily play it around either making less than 5 summons or just summoning Arvada, which negates the effect of Nib in the hand. So personally, I don't really like NIBIRU right now. The deck is not a super heavy combo deck. They are kind of ending typically in the Garunix plus like a Skyburn set, you know, maybe like a Avatar Kieran in hand that's searched off the Brong. So it's not really like board. It's more of a grind game, kind of pseudo, putting up 1 or 2 interruptions, have the Sanctuary online, and have a bunch of hand traps the way it's played right now. NIBIRU will get a lot better, I think, after the Phantom Nightmare drops when there are more card extenders that actually play in the deck. But again, Arvada just kind of puts a damper in the situation of Nib because they can easily establish Arvada before their 5th summon if their hand is decently good. So it's not a card I would personally bring in against the deck. But again, you can sometimes catch them off guard. It has its niche interactions if you're pairing it with other hand traps as well. So it's not like that horrible. Ghost Spell is actually decent against this deck. Why? Well, there are cards that resurrect from the graveyard. For example, Fire King High Avatar Kieran. When this card is destroyed, you can special summon Fire King from their hand or graveyard, then pop a card. You Ghost Spelling this card does 2 things. It stops them from getting a body onto the board, and it stops them from popping a card, whether that be your card or one of their own cards to further extend. So this card is actually quite good against this deck, and on top of all of that, this card also stops rare cards like Nadir Servant that some Fire King decks are experimenting with. You know, we talked about it in one of my other Squidios. They actually go for Dogmatica Maximus, and then they start going off into the races, and they are actually able to dump a copy of Shurag and then Garuda to search a copy of Phoenix. So having that niche interaction that might come up is useful as well. And on top of all of that, this has a lot of crossover against decks like Labyrinth hitting the big welcome. So I don't see why not. If you're siding this card already, you could definitely bring it in against this card. Them resurrecting something off of Kieran is crucial. And also Arvada has another effect when it's destroyed to resurrect a Fire Beast, Beast Warrior, or Winged Beast monster from the graveyard. We can't forget this effect, of course, guys. So there's a lot of usage for Ghost Spell. I think it's decently good. You can also, of course, negate the Sacred Fire King Garunix from coming back from the graveyard as well. So, you know, there are a lot of interactions, of course. How can we forget? This is probably the main one we should have let off with. But yes, Garunix does resurrect itself from the graveyard. Same thing with DD Crow. You know, we talked about Belle just stopping stuff from the graveyard. Well, DD Crow can also stop the target of the Sacred Fire King Garunix from coming back, which is really, really handy. Now, the issue is with Fire King High Avatar Kirin, it doesn't target in the graveyard, so you having DD Crow could actually backfire. They could just summon something else, or they can summon something from the hand. It's only a lot better against the Mega Chicken because you're actually getting it out of the grave for the rest of the duel. There are cards like Avatar Arvada, which actually does target, so that just has some utility. You can potentially stop the Phoenix from coming back, but I mean, they've already gotten their value when they're trying to resurrect it back from the standby phase, so I don't think it's as good. Personally, I think Belle is a lot better than Crow, but if you're already playing Crow for other matchups like Purely and Tearlaments, then maybe you could argue bring this in just for the Fire King Sky Sacred Garunix. Skullmeister is another card in the vein of Belle and DD Crow. It stops card effects in the graveyard, but this has a lot more usage against Fire King specifically because you're not only stopping Fire King Garunix and then Kirin and Arvada, but you're also stopping the other cards that activate in the graveyard. So cards like Fire King Avatar Barong, you can stop them from searching. You can stop the Phoenix from coming back. You can even stop the effect of the Hyang. When this card is destroyed, they can summon back a bunch of Fire King monsters from the graveyard, so that's something else you can stop. Obviously, Belle works as well. And even Fire King Island, when this card is removed from the field, they can actually pop their entire field. Sometimes they make use of this and actually nuke their board to reset their combo. So having that ability to just negate that from happening is definitely something that's highly relevant. This has a lot of crossover against Unchained as well. You're stopping their Unchained effects in the graveyard. So there's some, you know, marginal utility across the metagame for this card. It stops Tearlament names in the graveyard as well. In addition to the Tearlaments like DD Crow and Belle, this actually does work on the Unchained stuff, so I think it's marginally better in that aspect. So these cards are all decently good. Unfortunately, Skullmeister doesn't hit the Labyrinth matchup, which is one of the most popular decks right now, judging from the results in the YCS. So personally, I still think Belle is probably the best out of these 4 cards, but or the 3 cards rather. But you know, like play around depending on your metagame, you can definitely tweak and play with them a little bit. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit is not that great against this deck. The only reason I bring it up is there's a marginal usage by stopping Fire King Island, which also inadvertently nukes their board. When Fire King Island is removed from the field, they have to destroy all monsters they control, which sometimes doesn't really hurt, you know, for the most part, because they don't care about their stuff getting popped. But if you can catch them in an awkward spot, there are some decks playing Fenrir in their Fire King deck as well. Just catching them and then nuking their board sometimes does have a little bit of value. Personally, I don't think Ghost Spell, or Ghost Ogre rather, is that good of a card in the metagame right now, besides hitting something else like a Centurion. I just don't think this card does enough. So I don't think you guys should be siding it, period. But if you are siding it for whatever reason, there is an argument to potentially just use it on the Fire King Island, but I wouldn't bring it in the matchup because it doesn't really hit anything else effectively. Like, they just like getting their stuff popped, right? So you could use it against Sanctuary as well when they try to XYZ summon. That's another card you can hit. Dimension Shifter, I don't think we need to mention this card. It's absolutely busted against graveyard-based strategies, and Fire King happens to be a graveyard-based destruction strategy. So yeah, Shifter is a very much a staple if you can afford to play it. Veiler's not bad. Veiler, Infinite Impermanence, and Ghost Mourner. You can obviously hit the Phoenix to prevent them from searching. You can also hit the Garunix to prevent them from dumping. Now, you do take a gamble every time you do that, because if they open Fire King Avatar Kirin in their hand, they can quick effect chain it to destroy that monster you're targeting, special out the Kirin, pop that monster, that effect will then resolve because it's no longer on the field. A lot like how Unchained Shavara interacts with cards like Tour Guide when you try to Veiler or Imperm them. So that's just one thing to be aware of. You could potentially argue to hit the Dark Witch, or the Black Witch rather, when they do try to set a Sinful Spoils card, because this guarantees that they're not going to be able to interact with the Kirin, and then if they don't have access to the Phoenix, which they're trying to set up, then that means, you know, you might be in a good spot. So this is definitely something I would rather use if they're starting off their plays. I would rather Imperm and Veiler this. Of course, if they're starting off with the Phoenix, sometimes you just have to take the dice and gamble that they don't have the Kirin. It's a 3-up. They might not have it. If you're waiting for the Imperm and Veiler and you skip past the Phoenix and they didn't have the Kirin, then you just get punished, right? So in my opinion, you know, just use it without any fear if you have to. But if they start off with the Black Witch, let's just hit this and be safe and just ignore the chance, the possibility of getting blown out. Board wipes. Evenly Matched is decently good against this deck because you're wiping their entire board. You're wiping the Fire King Island. You're wiping the whatever monsters they have on the board. And the nice thing about this deck is they don't actually put up any solid Omni Negates. So you are actually clearing all of their board except for like one monster. They might leave something like an Arvada with a Kirin still in their hand. And then the potentially Garunix in their graveyard if they try to nuke it with the Kirin in the main phase. So just interact with their graveyard. Make sure you account for the cards in the graveyard or Garunix potentially coming back out of the graveyard or the hand after you wipe their board. But other than that, I think this is is a very effective card against the deck because you are wiping them down to 1 card. It's a very, very big tempo boost. And the other thing is you probably shouldn't be entering your battle phase against this deck anyways, because Garunix does trigger when their monsters are destroyed by battle. So if they have a measly Avada on the field and you try to run it over by battle, you are going to be punished because Garunix will come back, it will dump the Kirin. Kirin will resurrect that same Arvada. They will get to pop a card non-targeting, and they just built the board thanks to you skipping your battle phase and attacking. So key thing to note there. That's why even the match I think is a little bit better, because you don't really need your battle phase. Other board wipes like Lightning Storm, just not very good. I mean, you can destroy the field spell and nuke their board, but then that triggers off their monsters, so it doesn't really do much. Personally, I just think the card is horrible. I would rather play cards like Cosmic Cyclone, which does a lot for the deck going first and second. Going first, you can disrupt the Fire King Island, which is very, very useful. You can also hit the Sanctuary. Going second, you can snipe their back rows. It just has a lot of utility as a card, and I just love how much matchups this card actually is effective against going first and second. So I would love to side this card over something like Lightning Storm right now, and I recommend that you guys do that as well. Super Polymerization is alright against this deck because all of their monsters are basically fire in different types, so you are going to be able to go into the Mud Dragon very easily, and then you can obviously Super Poly off whatever they bring out, like the big Mega Chicken as well as the Arvada, and without destroying them, so they don't prompt the triggers of their effects, and they obviously cannot respond, so you're just fusing off their entire board, and Kirin's just not going to come out after that. So I do actually like it against this deck. I think it's going to be a lot better after Phantom Nightmare when all of the Broken Fire stuff comes out, and this card is just very, very powerful, but even still, right now, it's not horrible. Forbidden Droplet and cards like potentially Forbidden Chalice are okay against this deck as well, because you can actually hit the Fire King Garunix when it comes back, or you can just target the Arvada to prevent it from negating one of your monster effects, so it's not the end of the world. I think these cards are decently good. They're not super high impact, so you definitely have to play a deck that can make use of the send for Droplet. Like if you have like Pot of Prosperity or Reinforcement of the Army or stuff to send for free, then it's a lot better. But on its own, if you're negging to play this card into a board, it's never really that good in my opinion. And then last but not least, Triple Tactics Talent and Triple Tactics Thrust. Well, Tactics Talent is okay against this deck because they do trigger all their effects in the main phase, but Thrust is typically amazing against this deck for the reason that, well, if you guys haven't noticed, Legendary Fire King Ponix is actually a mandatory effect. During the next standby phase after this card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, add this card back to your hand. That's a mandatory effect that cannot skip. And same with Fire King Avatar Barong. These are mandatory trigger effects that they have to activate in the following standby phase. So if they destroy them on their turn, which typically they do, then they will be triggering them in your standby phase on the next turn, meaning Thrust will always be live unless they make an effort to play around Thrust, which they'd probably make a mediocre board doing so. So Thrust being always live against this deck is absolutely amazing. Obviously, Tactics Talent, you will have to bait something out in the main phase by destroying something or baiting out in an Arvada, but Thrust being able to search for any board wipe or any engine card is so amazing, gets this deck going second. I highly recommend this card as a board breaker for the sheer fact that they just can't play around it effectively because all the cards are mandatory. So it's a funny thing that they actually made this mandatory. They haven't done mandatory effects in a long time, I feel like, in Yu-Gi-Oh! So that's all we had for today's video. What do you guys think about the Fire King deck in general? Do you guys think this is a pushover deck right now without the new stuff, or is it actually a deck that is somewhat decent because it topped the YCS, right? You know, so let us know if there are any cards that you like to play against this deck that we missed in this video. Other than that, rate, comment, subscribe to support the channel, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.